I think he had this dream in which his father said, "You got to do this."
Good afternoon, everyone.
So,
All right, we are pulling into the end of our first day with a wonderful treat as our last presenter, Pat Mulroy, whom I'm delighted to introduce as our keynote speaker. She has a new book out. If you were listening to our local radio, she was presenting on this a few days ago. Pat Mulroy is serving currently as non-resident senior fellow for climate adaptation and environmental policy for the Brookings Institution, and as the practitioner in residence for the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, William S. Boyd School of Law, which I think is longer just by 2 words than ours. She also has a faculty position at the Desert Research Institute, where she serves as the Mackay Distinguished Faculty Associate, and she's also on the Wynn Resorts Limited Board of Directors, and as she just mentioned to me, she does not do retirement well. So, between 1989 and 2014, Pat served as general manager of both the Las Vegas Valley Water District and the Southern Nevada Water Authority. She was the principal architect of the Southern Nevada Water Authority, helping to guide Southern Nevada and Las Vegas through one of the worst droughts in its history in the Colorado River. She is now focusing on helping communities in water-stressed areas throughout the American Southwest and the world to develop strategies to increase water resource availability. I literally have another page I could go through on her biography, but I want to hear from her, so I'm stopping with that. And a big round of applause for Pat Mulroy, our keynote speaker.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure for me to be back here in Utah, and it was really delightful to be greeted by snow as I got off the plane. Bearing in mind that 2 days ago in Vegas it was 90 degrees, teeing off of what Jonathan was talking about earlier. It's going to dip back down to 53, but that won't last long. So I am delighted to be a little chilly up here because I'm not ready for a long, hot summer quite yet. Before I get started, there are a couple people from Las Vegas that I really need to recognize. And she mentioned the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution, and with us here today is the founder of the Saltman Center for Conflict Resolution, Mike Saltman, and his wife, Sonia. And I am delighted that they came down from their house in Park City to partake in this discussion. I'm going to be unorthodox. Not that that shocks anybody who's known me for any amount of time. And as I sat listening to some of my favorite people presenting, I've known Jonathan for a while. In fact, I brought him to Las Vegas, and Brad Udall and I first really started working together in '07 when there were 7 of us water utilities that actually took climate change seriously and met up in Hetch Hetchy at the invitation of Susan Leal and sequestered ourselves for 3 days in order to discuss in depth both adaptation and mitigation responsibilities around climate change. And Brad joined us and beat us up with a stick during the whole 3 days. So if there were any doubters left by the time the 3 days were over, I would be shocked. But as I was listening to the last 3 presentations, a couple of things clicked with me. And it is not a religious discussion about whether there is climate change or there's not climate change. And I have reached the conclusion that it is not climate deniers that we're dealing with. We're dealing with people who politically don't care. Now, why don't they care? Because they don't want to go home and face a constituency where people are unable to feed their families anymore because they lost their job as we mitigate climate change, where communities are devastated. We do a great job talking the science of climate change, and we do a great job talking about adaptation, but we don't listen. Maybe that's why the election results that we got is what we got. You can tell where I was on that spectrum. We don't listen. People are losing their livelihoods. People are losing their ability to survive. And I have told my environmental friends time and time again, never, ever, ever poke someone in the eye with their human survivability instinct will come out. When you unleash that monster, you're not going to like what happens next. And that's what's happening around the globe. There are two things that are coming together in a very rapid clash: an exploding population and a climate that is dramatically changing. And 80% of the world's population neither understands it nor can they wrap their head around it. All they know is that they see no future for themselves. To them, it's about human society. It's not about the ecosystem. It's not about whether we water managers can make sure that there's adequate water in the tap. Heck, we're one of the few countries in the world that actually has 24/7 water service. Go into Argentina, go into Brazil, go into Asia, go into Northern Africa, and that luxury does not exist. They are lucky if they get 1 or 2 days of water, if that. So we've been living in a bubble, and we've been talking to ourselves. I watched, and I totally understand the passion around the Grand Canyon. I have had the unbelievable privilege of actually having rafted through the Grand Canyon. And you have to know that I'm saying this, and the thing I hate more in the world than anything else is camping. But I will acknowledge that it was one of the most splendid experiences sitting there at night. How many people in this country can afford and will ever have that opportunity? Will it really matter to the young man who can't find a job in downtown Los Angeles? Will it really matter to the young man in the Rust Belt who lost his job? Will it really matter to the senior citizen on Social Security who doesn't know where his next meal's coming from? I don't agree with Stegner anymore. Just the fact that we know it's there doesn't make it real for us and doesn't make us want to protect it. It's not doing anything for me. My survival instinct's out, and that's what I'm caring about. I care that I can feed my family. I care that I have a job. I care that there is a society and an urban structure around me that will allow me to live. We need to listen. We have, over the years, built a system of laws and regulatory structures that have strangled this country in many, many ways. And the consequences of that are coming home to bear. Those of us in this room who actually accept the science of climate change, realize what it means to the planet, to our children, to our grandchildren, understand the consequences of what not only potentially could happen, but will most assuredly happen if left unattended. We need to start dealing with ourselves even differently in how we manage the rivers, how we manage the groundwater basins, how we manage them conjunctively. And I've been the eternal optimist, and I think the Colorado River community has given me ample reason to be optimistic. In so many ways, we are so far ahead of so many other regions around the country in that journey of adaptation, because it's a journey, it is not an event. Human beings inherently hate change. And the older I get, the more I understand that. We don't like to change, and we only change if we absolutely have to. And there is a good reason for us to change. We are as habitual a creature as there possibly could be. Climate and population increase colliding. The planet will have 9 billion people. 9 billion people who have to eat. 9 billion people who need water for their own existence. 9 billion people who've become addicted to technology. Even in the tiniest villages in Asia, they're running around with cell phones. It takes 1,300 gallons of water to make a single cell phone battery. Imagine how much water is going into the battery business. A Tesla plant going in right outside of Reno will use as much water as all of Carson City. It's not just food that we use our water for. It's those things that we've become so dependent on. The World Economic Forum that I have had the great privilege to work with for the last 3 years says because of this population boom, global food supplies have to go up by 50 to 60% by the year 2030. Where's that going to come from? In our basin, we now have the country of Saudi Arabia owning ranches in Arizona. The Imperial Irrigation District exports $1.5 billion worth of food exports into Asia every single year. We're a food exporting nation. And I've heard many of my academic friends and science friends say we're exporting our water. Well, we're importing a lot of water from China with every cell phone battery. So everything has a water footprint. The challenge is, how low can that water footprint go? And those 9 billion people need energy. The amount of water that we predict will be needed to produce energy will increase by 80% by 2050. Now, at the same time, we have this massive population boom. We have a climate that is altering everything around us and affecting us in our water supply probably the most poignantly. Those two are going to have a very hard time coming together. And that's why the conversations we're having with the people in this country need to change to where they care. It's not that they deny, it's that they don't care. And if we can accept the fact that they don't care because it's not within their sphere of relevance, because there are other things motivating them, we can change the way we have this conversation with them. And we can change the way we have a conversation with ourselves. There are some key barriers, self-inflicted key barriers to being able to adapt. Let's look at some of those. And many of them are historic legacy. Our Western system of prior appropriation made a lot of sense in the 19th century. Looks a little bit different today. Now, I would never suggest, I'm not suicidal by nature, nor do I think it's a very productive exercise, that we abandon or try to overturn the notion of prior appropriation. But we can overlay it. Because let me give you a great example on the Colorado River system, why those so heralded water rights become meaningless. Sitting down on the southern tip of California is the Imperial Irrigation District. They have a prior perfected right given to them by the United States Supreme Court. The Secretary of Interior can do cartwheels down Pennsylvania Avenue, and he can't touch that water right. They are one of but a few very cherished prior perfected rights. Fast forward in a world of climate change and unmitigated and unchanged habits on the Colorado. And Lake Mead, that's full at 1220, today sits at around 1078, drops down below 900. Not a drop of water leaves Lake Mead and goes downstream. Zero. It physically can't get out of the lake and pass the dam and get to Havasu or get to Imperial or get to Morales. So what good does that prior perfected right do the Imperial Irrigation District? Nothing. It does them absolutely no good. It does Mexico no good, and it does no one in Arizona any good. There is a need in this system, and the states are doing it right now. And what is really, in my mind, makes this a really huge step forward is the concept of what is being worked on was really introduced by the environmental community. Conservation before shortage. But not conservation for the sake of taking it off the system and putting it in groundwater basins, but saying we as citizens of this basin and as stakeholders in this basin and as mutually interdependent users of this system have a responsibility to the system. If the system crashes, there are no winners and losers. There are only losers. If the system crashes, we're done. So the concept is that in the lower basin, the 3 lower basin states conserve early and leave that water behind in Lake Mead with no one's name on it. They can never touch it again. They're giving it back to the system to prop the system up so that all can survive. It is almost like a concept that jumped off the page at me when I read it, when my friend Doug Yoder wrote it in his Florida chapter in the book. In Florida, in southern Florida, because of the threats of intruding ocean waters into their groundwater system and these king tides that they're now experiencing that are flooding streets in Miami and in other parts of southern Florida, The jurisdictions have entered into a climate compact. Think about this. They have entered into an adaptation compact, an agreement between very autonomous, very self-contained entities that will suffer a common fate. To have policies, to have infrastructure, to have laws that blend and mesh and don't clash with one another, that work together to a common goal. The concept of a climate compact is something I think is something well worth exploring, and something we could twist and make look very differently in very different locations. It is the understanding and the recognition of a shared fate. I have for years been saying, we don't get it in this basin. We think, at best, we think of a hydrographic basin. But look at all the water that's leaving the basin. Guys, I love you, but Wasatch Front's not in the Colorado River watershed. It's not. And yet you enjoy Colorado River water. Albuquerque, not in the Colorado River watershed. They get Colorado River water. They're in the Rio watershed. Denver certainly isn't in the Colorado River watershed. You got to pump it across the Continental Divide to get it there. And neither are Los Angeles, San Diego, Santa Barbara, 20 million people in Southern California. Yet half their water supply comes from the Colorado River watershed. And because the other half of their water comes from the Bay Delta and the Colorado River watershed are inextricably linked. Many of you know what Metropolitan had to do last year. Last year, Metropolitan, because of the drought in the Sierras, got zero water off the State Water Project. They lost over half their water supply. The reservoirs were strained from the years before, where they had already had to go into their local reserves, like their East Side Reservoir and the other large reservoirs they have within California. And so the year the Colorado River was going to be strained to the max because of low precipitation, the water that Metropolitan had wisely stored in Mead through dry year option agreements with Palo Verde, and that they had banked in Lake Mead, they had to take out. They couldn't survive without it. So the year Mead was going to go down anyway, Met had to strain it further. They had no choice. The two systems are connected. What happens in the San Joaquin, Sacramento, Bay Delta matters in Denver, and it matters in Salt Lake City. We're not 7 silos. We are absolutely glued at the hip. A climate compact that recognizes those disparate pieces having a common future that needs a common way of addressing it. The conservation before shortage is a great first step. I just pray that it can be aggressive enough and that it can come quickly enough to where it actually does the job it needs to do. Ironically, had we not signed Minute 319 in 2012 with Mexico, Mead would already be in shortage. It was Mexico's additional banking, along with Met's, along with ours, that propped Lake Mead up by 10 feet. Not naturally, it wasn't naturally 10 feet higher. It was because Mexico fallowed land early, allowed for rotational fallowing with its farmers, and we, the United States, said you can store that in Lake Mead. because you have no other way to create a drought buffer. They too are part of a climate compact. What we have held dear for 100 years, prior appropriations, a view of the Colorado River Compact that it is an allocation tool that gives X amount of water to each one of the states. We need to start thinking about those a little bit differently, without ever having to give up that water right that we have. How do we keep it as a safety net and yet move beyond it to something that actually will help us survive? The other great impediment is regulatory. We live in an environment of regulatory paralysis at this moment. And part of it is attributed to the uncertainties that climate change brings. In the water community, if I've heard one speech, I've heard 150 speeches about planning into the cone of uncertainty. And you just know what the sideboards are. Well, how do you develop a model when you do an analysis on a water resource when you don't know what's going to be happening? Climate compact. Can we replace a regulatory paradigm with a process paradigm? Can we make the process have longevity and the agreements be in shorter time segments? We've not taken the element of time into our regulatory and into our process, considering how we consider moving forward. We do it on the river, we just don't realize we do it. There is an operating plan adopted every 5 years. All the stakeholders participate in the development of that operating plan. That concept that you have a process that allows you to make the necessary shifts and modifications as conditions change. Just because the model says that if these conditions exist and I run a system in X way, I will get Y consequence, that doesn't tell me that that makes that water resource untouchable. What it tells me is that under these conditions, I can't run it in X fashion, or I will get those consequences. We can't operate 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, every water source. The concept of a stranded asset in our infrastructure is something that will happen on a year-to-year basis. MEC just went through it. They had a stranded infrastructure going all the way up to the Bay Delta. Not a drop of water in it. Now, this year it'll be fine. Last year it wasn't. We need to move around how we take water, where we take it from, and adapt to the conditions as the conditions unfold in front of us. If we don't get a handle on the regulatory problem, I am holding my breath that the very same dynamic, that human survival spirit, is going to start attacking three things that I don't think this country can afford to lose: the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and the Endangered Species Act. But they're not working anymore. They have become the great stoppers. You can stop anything with those three, but you won't build one piece of needed infrastructure. On the East Coast, the cities are butting their head up against the Clean Water Act. And in New York, up against the Safe Drinking Water Act. One of our main drivers out here is the Endangered Species Act. A well-meaning judge in California shut down the pumps in the Bay Delta in order to save the fish. Not a single fish has been saved. And in the meantime, wet years in that water system were lost. They couldn't be brought down and they couldn't be stored. Because the problems of the Bay Delta go well beyond water. They go to land formations that are death traps. They go to non-native species that were artificially introduced that are eating the native species. It's a much more complex problem than the pumping of water. If a community, if we hadn't had a wet year like this year, now think about this, Met was going to be in big trouble this year. They used up their reserves in the Colorado, in Lake Mead, and they had used up their storage that from what they had brought in from the Bay Delta. I'm not so sure that a real crisis with 20 million people is a place we want to go. I'm not sure that this community would want to see it in their own city. We have to find new ways, new processes to be able to bridge through this collision of population and climate change. Now, I will always be the eternal optimist, and I have watched the Colorado River Basin change in how it addresses and how it deals with one another. 20 years ago, we argued not only about the shape of the table, but how many people could be in the room. We couldn't stand each other because we didn't know each other. Today, any one of us can make the arguments for the other participants. I can stand up and I can give Jim Lochhead's speech about Denver water's problems as well as he can. And he can give them about Las Vegas. I can give the speech about the Central Arizona Project and its dilemmas, or Metropolitan's dilemmas. Over the last 20 years, we have finally changed the process. Took time, took some doing, but it will allow the system to survive. And at the end of the day, that's going to be the key. So, I know that infrastructure is something that is absolutely going to have to be addressed in this country. And I would agree with what Jonathan said. Taking down dams right now sounds about as silly a notion as anything I could imagine. When storage is important, yes, the temperatures are going up. But yes, there's a lot of dependency on those reservoirs. Not to mention that the upper basin will go crazy if you take down Glen Canyon Dam. They care about it more than the lower basin does, because it's their safety net. They made an obligation to send 75 million acre feet over 10 years to the lower basin. It's in the compact. And if they don't, if you guys don't, we'll make a call. Which means you shut off whatever you need to shut off until you've delivered the amount of water that you have to deliver to the lower basin. Which is why after the 50s drought, the upper basin said, we need a savings account. We need to be able to make those lower basin deliveries without jeopardizing our communities. So there's far more that goes into the existence of those two reservoirs than merely storage for the sake of storage. It is the whole political complexity between the upper and the lower basin. This country has to refurbish its crumbling infrastructure. And the biggest impediment in that is the regulatory. And the other, and I'm just going to have to say it as the final thing, it's the way we've structured municipal water utilities. This is not something that everybody who's in the water business has known it, and nobody has wanted to talk about it. Water departments are embedded in cities, and they function like other departments. They get a budget at the beginning of the fiscal year, and if they don't spend it, the money all goes back to the general fund of the city. How do you do an asset management plan when you don't have dedicated resources? How do you function like that? You can't. You'll never have enough money because the water rates that you're charging your customers aren't paying for water service. They're paying for parks, they're paying for police, and they're paying for fire. That's why the American people think their water bill's a tax, as opposed to their power bill and their gas bill, their cell phone bill, and their cable bill. Because we treat it like a tax. Now that's starting to change. Louisville has set up a structure where the municipal utility is a self-sustaining financial entity. And it has one shareholder because the city of Louisville can't wean itself that quickly from those revenues. It has one shareholder, the city of Louisville. But how much is paid is known up front. Just like any investor-owned utility in a regulatory process has to indicate to the regulator how much they want to return to their shareholders. Same thing. It's embedded in the rate, it's transparent, everybody knows the utility can manage its financial resources. We can't just run to Congress with our tin cup and not fix our own house. Now, in the West, we're in a lot better shape than they are in the East when it comes to this, but we really need to think about it. Nobody's going to give us that money anymore. It's not there. So the decades where the federal government built everything are over. So looking inward and fixing that which we have is just as important. And I will end on that, but say that these changes are already happening. People are already starting to think differently. There are, if you look around the country, models of where people have begun to recognize and have been willing to confront the challenges. And we will survive. It's going to be a bumpy ride, but I am very optimistic. I agree with Jonathan. From a risk assessment standpoint, we would be insane not to assume that the worst is possible. But we can better be ready for it. So I say thank you, and I'm more than pleased to take any questions that you might have.
And we actually have several minutes for questions, so if people will again come up to the microphones to ask their questions.
Thank you. Can you speak to the retirement of the Navajo generating station?
That was another tough one. The issue with the Navajo generating station wasn't even necessarily the price of cheap coal energy for the Central Arizona project. It was the lifeblood for the Hopi and the Navajo Indians. And how do you shut it down and shut down the livelihood of those tribes? That's the challenge around the Navajo station. And I'd have to ask someone in Arizona where they are in that journey to try to find a replacement for that. But you can't just shut down the livelihood for those tribes. And it's just like the Wallapai we were talking about, where they built the big lookout. It wasn't just their latest economic development plan. It was to lift them out of poverty. to put food on the table for the tribe. Look at the condition our tribes live in. I mean, we love heralding their history, and if they have sacred ground, we embrace it because it speaks to what we like to hear. But they're starving to death. They don't have an economy. And so if the Navajo are talking about a zip line and the Wallapai built the platform and they're taking advantage of a Las Vegas economy with Chinese coming in every 45 seconds who want to go see the Grand Canyon, who can blame them? They're lifting their people out of poverty. That's not a bad thing to do. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you for a very thoughtful and provocative talk. It was very informative. I particularly like the emphasis on caring about climate change and its impacts on ourselves and other people, future generations. That entails caring about each other as well. And extending that just a little further, I want to raise a question about caring for ecosystems and wildlife. I thought I heard you say at one point that you don't think we can risk losing the Endangered Species Act and the Clean Water Act, but you also said that we've got these regulatory impediments that have to be dismantled or something similar. And on the face of it, those two ideas seem to clash a little bit. So, at least to me, I'd like you to address that.
I'm so glad you asked me that because it probably was a piece I forgot. I passionately believe that the future is about co-equal goals. That in every discussion, there have to be co-equal goals. We have to protect the human society and we have to protect the ecosystem. And it is possible. I think minute 319 with Mexico proved it. It is possible. We can have co-equal goals. But we need to be willing, and we have very rigid constituencies on either side of this, willing to open up and accept that there will be co-equal goals. And it will be an adaptive process, changing every year as conditions change.
Thank you for provoking us. I was very happy to hear the first mention today of population. I don't see how we can have this conversation about climate change unless it is linked to population. At the same time we communicate our environmental needs, population has to be part of it, and at the same time the states are doing everything possible, and Washington, to prevent any kind of population control with any kind of funds, either at the state or local level in so many areas. How do you see this conversation developing without us almost concurrently discussing climate and population?
That is the juggernaut, and that we talk about no growth, right? How do you do it? I know one community that has successfully implemented no growth, and that's because they're a federal charter city and own every square inch of land within the city limits, and only release enough land to the extent they want to see that growth. If you don't own the land, you cannot control the growth. If we as a country say, and there are both sides of this, some of us are more open to immigration, others are less open to immigration. Well, no growth policies are no more than local wall building. It's the same thing. People are going to go somewhere, and there are states like California that are not growing because of immigration. They're growing because their births are exceeding their deaths. Our healthcare system allows us to live longer. We gratefully have a very low, if any, infant mortality rate. The net sum of that is people living longer, more people being added, the numbers grow. Intrinsically, they grow. So we need to find a way to make every human's water footprint that much smaller. But that's where the clash is coming, because it's redefining our space and our spatial relationships vis-a-vis the next person, and it's getting crowded. It'll be tense. Mr. Udall, how are you?
So thoughtful, provocative, stimulating, thank you. For the record, I do not remember beating you with a stick at Hetch Hetchy. I would like to know about your book. I know you have been working on it, and you have a variety of contributors to it. So please tell us about your book.
First of all, this is my first book experience. I've never sold a book, but thank you for giving me this 5-minute ad time. What I did is I asked all my friends, I abused all my friendships, and I went to those, mainly the ones that we had with us at Hetch Hetchy, who were early adapters, and then shortly after that, Miami joined, and I asked them to describe their challenges around adapting to climate change. The real interesting ones are Kansas and Nebraska. Talk about two different worldviews on the same groundwater basin. Two very different worldviews on the same groundwater basin. And the writer of the Kansas chapter on the science part of it has a brilliant concept of how to bring science, hydrologic, climate science, and policy making together in an iterative, ongoing process way, using models. So I would advise you to read that part. So I think it is a snapshot of where some of the major jurisdictions are in this country, from New York to Miami to Kansas to Nebraska to the Colorado River Basin, to the Bay Delta, to San Diego, a snapshot in time. This is where we are along this journey's path. But it shows how these communities have changed the way they're thinking about things. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. You said it took the last 20 or so years for the states of the Colorado River Compact to get on the same page to the point where you guys really understand one another. So what lessons can be learned from that 20-year experience so it hopefully doesn't take another 20 years when we get different water users or different disciplines into the same room? How can we kind of speed up that process?
You know what's been really interesting is that the players in the Colorado River community have changed, right? They have changed in every single state. But the forum now has a culture of its own. And whoever received it from the last group becomes the carrier of that culture to the next group. So there is this generational handing off that's happening. The conversation is very different. The one thing I beg everyone is keep the politicians out of it. Sorry about that.
Pat, thank you for being here today. You're clearly one of the giants in water management, and we're grateful for your presence here. My question is about agriculture. We've heard some of the kind of mega negotiations at high levels between cities. What is your advice on having these climate compacts involve farmers and ranchers in a way that's politically feasible, that results in win-win for nature and people?
I think the very first thing, and it's become something I've become very vocal on, and trust me, where my head was 15, 20 years ago, these words never would have come out of my mouth. But we've got to stop flogging the agricultural sector and saying, we have a problem and it's your fault. 70% of the world's water is used for agriculture. Always has been, always will. It may come down a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be that way. And I think as much as the cities are looking to the farmer to be flexible and be a part of the solution, I think the cities owe the farmer to be a part of his solution as well. And on the river, we can do it. And a great example is what we did for the Mexican farmers, right? We said, we will allow you to use our reservoirs to store drought protection water for yourself. Because you can't store it anywhere in that silty soil in the Colorado River Delta. So it's a mutual future, and if you can envision that mutual future, not threaten their water rights, keep the water rights, keep all your legal protections, but recognize that there might be a way to where the cities can help the farmer and the farmer can help the cities. That battle has got to stop, because the future is about a very close cooperation between those two sectors. Thank you, and now everyone gets to have a drink now.
Okay, just to finish up the day with a few announcements and reminders. First of all, I want to mention that our caterer for this event is Even Stevens, and one of the reasons we use them is for every sandwich, if you had the breakfast burritos this morning or meal you partake of, they donate to a local food bank or nonprofit. So it's a one-to-one helping back of the community. So thank you for helping our community with that. Second of all, our continental breakfast tomorrow will begin at 8:30 a.m. and the symposium will resume promptly at 9. So we hope to see you tomorrow. If you're not going to be able to join us tomorrow, please do fill out an evaluation. We have forms, or you can do it online. We have computers out there you can use. You can link it yourself on your own computer by going to law.utah.edu/research/Stegner. And that will take you to the evaluation form. We would very much appreciate if you fill that out. And then finally, I'd like to end the day by again thanking our principal funders and sponsors, the R. Harold Burton Foundation, which was our founding donor since 1996, the Cultural Vision Fund, the S.J. and Jesse E. Quinney Foundation, the Nature Conservancy in Utah, and our own student Natural Resources Law Forum. So thank you all for being here today. I hope to see you all tomorrow, and enjoy your evening.